Open the garage, Mr. Mercer. HOA inspection. The woman standing at the bottom of the driveway said it with the kind of smile people use when they've spent years getting away with telling other adults what to do. Her name was Denise Holbrook, president of the Maple Ridge Estates HOA, late 50s, pearl earrings, clipboard tucked under one arm, like she was reporting for military duty instead of bothering a man who hadn't even finished unpacking his kitchen boxes yet. And standing in front of her, wearing dusty work jeans and holding half a socket wrench, was Ethan Mercer, brand new homeowner, recently divorced, moved in from Charlotte, just trying to rebuild his life in peace. Behind him, inside the garage, sat a partially assembled riding mower, still wrapped in factory plastic, blades not even attached yet. Ethan looked at Denise for about 3 seconds too long, then finally said, "Inspection for what exactly?" Denise flipped a page on her clipboard dramatically, like she had rehearsed this little performance in front of a mirror, then said, "According to standard procedure, all new residents are required to comply with lawn equipment verification to ensure insurance and community safety standards." Now listen, most people hear words like insurance and community safety, and their brain just shuts off, because nobody wants trouble 2 days after moving into a neighborhood where everyone already knows each other. That's how people like Denise operate. They bury demands under official-sounding language and count on you being too tired to challenge it. But Ethan didn't move, didn't step aside, didn't do the nervous homeowner laugh either. He just leaned against the garage frame and asked one very annoying question. Which section of the HOA bylaws gives you authority to inspect private equipment inside my garage? And man, the temperature changed immediately. Denise blinked once, smile tightening just enough to show she wasn't used to resistance. "It's standard procedure," she repeated, slower this time, like he was hard of hearing. Ethan nodded. "That's not what I asked." You could practically hear the suburban birds stop chirping. Denise adjusted the clipboard against her chest and gave him that classic HOA tone, fake polite with a little venom hiding underneath it. "Mr. Mercer, cooperation from homeowners helps keep property values stable." Ethan let out this tiny laugh under his breath and looked back toward the mower. "My property value isn't dropping because you haven't inspected my lawn tractor." Oof, wrong thing to say to someone like Denise. Because this wasn't really about grass. It wasn't about safety either. No, this was about authority, the kind some people get addicted to when their whole identity depends on controlling tiny pieces of other people's lives. Denise took one step closer to the garage opening, trying to peek around him. If there's nothing to hide, this shouldn't be a problem. And there it was, the line. The line every controlling person eventually uses when they realize they can't justify what they're doing. Ethan's face changed after that. Not angry, not emotional. Honestly, that almost made it worse. He just crossed his arms and said quietly, "That sentence usually means somebody's overstepping." Denise stared at him for another second, then scribbled something onto her clipboard hard enough to nearly tear the paper. "Fine, I'll follow up in writing." Then she turned around and marched down the driveway like she'd already decided he was going to become an example. What Denise didn't know, and what would eventually turn this entire neighborhood upside down, was that Ethan Mercer spent 12 years working as a senior compliance investigator for a financial risk consulting firm. His entire career revolved around reading policy language line by line, finding gaps in authority, identifying fraudulent procedure claims, and documenting liability exposure before companies got sued into the ground. In other words, she picked exactly the wrong guy to bluff. Ethan stood there in silence after she left, then slowly closed the garage door and walked inside. 10 minutes later, he was sitting at his kitchen counter with a cup of burnt coffee, laptop open, HOA governing documents spread across the table like evidence in a criminal trial. Grass height restrictions, yep. Approved fence colors, absolutely. Trash can visibility rules, ridiculous, but technically there. But nowhere, not one single line, gave the HOA authority to inspect privately owned equipment inside a resident's garage. And that's when Ethan realized something uncomfortable. Denise either didn't understand her own rules, or she understood them perfectly and simply assumed nobody would challenge her. 3 days later, the answer showed up taped to his front door. A bright orange violation notice. $250 for non-compliance with mandatory property safety inspection requirements. Signed personally by Denise Holbrook. Ethan stared at the paper for a long moment, then smiled. Not because he thought it was funny, but because he finally understood what kind of game this was going to be. Now let me pause the story for a second because this right here, this is where a lot of HOAs get people psychologically. And honestly, if you've never dealt with one before, it can feel weirdly intimidating. Somebody walks up holding a clipboard, throwing around phrases like community compliance and insurance exposure, and suddenly regular homeowners start acting like they're being audited by the federal government. But here's the thing, from a legal perspective, HOAs only have the authority specifically granted to them inside their governing documents. That's it. They don't get magical powers because they sound official. If the bylaws say they can inspect exterior landscaping, that does not automatically mean they can walk into your garage and start examining your personal equipment. Those are two very different legal boundaries. And people like Denise know most homeowners will never actually read the documents. That's the real trick. This is a psychological trap. Authority mixed with social pressure. Nobody wants to be labeled the difficult neighbor, especially right after moving in, so they comply first and ask questions later. Meanwhile, once enough people comply voluntarily, the HOA starts acting like the made-up rule has always existed. It becomes this weird suburban mythology where everybody says, well, they did it to me too, without ever asking whether it was legitimate in the first place. And honestly, Ethan understood something most people don't. Documentation beats emotion every single time. He didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't slam the door in Denise's face. He simply asked for the exact rule in writing, because once someone has to put questionable authority onto paper, that's usually where the cracks start showing. The lesson here is, if somebody claims they have authority over your property, never argue first. Ask for documentation first. Because legitimate rules survive scrutiny. Fake power usually collapses the second you ask where it came from. The next morning, Ethan didn't pay the fine, didn't call the HOA office either. Instead, he did something far more dangerous to people like Denise Hallbrook. He started creating a paper trail. He photographed the violation notice front and back, scanned it into a folder labeled Maple Ridge HOA, then drafted a formal written request asking the board to identify the exact covenant, bylaw, or enforcement provision authorizing interior inspection of privately owned lawn equipment stored inside residential garages. Cold language. Professional language. The kind of wording that instantly tells experienced people, oh, this guy knows what he's doing. He sent it certified mail before lunch. Then he waited. And waiting drove Denise insane. Because people who thrive on control usually expect emotional reactions. Yelling, panic, angry Facebook posts. Maybe some dramatic confrontation during a neighborhood meeting. Calm resistance? That's different. Calm resistance scares people because it suggests preparation. 2 days later, Ethan was tightening bolts on the mower when he noticed an older woman standing near the sidewalk watching him nervously. Small frame, silver hair, cardigan despite the heat. She finally walked over holding a folded grocery receipt in one hand like she needed emotional support from CVS. You're the one Denise cited, right? Ethan wiped grease from his hands. Guess word travels fast around here. The woman gave a dry little laugh. In this neighborhood? Faster than cable internet. Her name was Lorraine Bennett, 71 years old, retired elementary school librarian, lived across the street for almost a decade. And after about 30 seconds of awkward small talk, she quietly admitted something that made Ethan stop turning his wrench altogether. Denise had inspected her garage too. Not just hers, multiple homeowners. Lawn tools, paint cans, storage shelves, generators, even one guy's power washer setup. She said the HOA insurance required it. Lorraine explained softly, glancing around like Denise might emerge from a bush wearing binoculars. I didn't know any better. Ethan asked the obvious question. Did she ever show you the rule? Lorraine's silence answered before her mouth did. No, there it was. Pattern established. That changed everything. Because now this wasn't just a disagreement between a homeowner and an overbearing HOA president. Now Ethan had evidence of repeated enforcement behavior without documented authority. And trust me, in legal environments, patterns are where small problems become expensive problems. Ethan spent the next few days quietly talking to neighbors. Most were hesitant at first. Suburban people hate conflict, especially the kind that threatens property values and cookout invitations. But once one person starts talking, others usually follow. By the end of the week, Ethan had collected statements from 5 homeowners who'd been pressured into garage inspections over the past 3 years. Every single story sounded almost identical. Insurance compliance, standard procedure, safety verification, same phrases, same pressure tactics, same implied threat that refusing cooperation would somehow make them look suspicious. And the craziest part? Nobody had ever actually challenged it before. That's the thing about fake authority. It survives on momentum. The second somebody stops the machine and asks for proof, everybody suddenly realizes the emperor might not be wearing pants. Then came the HOA board meeting. Oh man, this was where the entire neighborhood started choosing sides. The clubhouse was packed tighter than anyone had seen in years. Folding chairs lined against beige walls, cheap coffee brewing in the back, residents whispering like they were attending a murder trial instead of discussing lawn violations. Denise sat at the front table with 2 other board members who already looked deeply uncomfortable just being associated with her. Ethan arrived carrying a thin black binder and sat quietly near the middle row. No dramatics. No speech prepared on giant poster boards. Just calm. Denise opened the meeting with that same polished HOA tone she always used. Before we begin, I'd like to address ongoing homeowner noncompliance regarding mandatory safety inspection procedures. Ethan raised his hand immediately. Can you identify the governing provision authorizing those inspections? You could actually feel the air leave the room. Denise forced a smile. Mr. Mercer, homeowner safety procedures fall under broad board discretion. Ethan nodded slowly like a professor listening to a student fail an oral exam. Okay. Which specific provision grants that discretion? Denise's jaw tightened. The board has authority to maintain community safety standards. Ethan opened the binder. Exterior community standards, yes. I read the CC and AMP, RS twice. There's no authorization for entering or inspecting private garages without owner consent. One of the other board members shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Denise jumped in fast before he could speak. We're not entering homes. Ethan leaned back calmly. A garage attached to a private residence is legally considered private property. Boom. There it was. The room got very quiet after that, because suddenly this wasn't sounding like one stubborn homeowner anymore. It sounded like liability. Denise made the mistake powerful people often make when they feel control slipping. She got emotional. If homeowners have nothing to hide, cooperation shouldn't be an issue. And immediately several people in the audience started murmuring. Ethan didn't even smile this time. That statement concerns me even more, he said quietly. Because rights aren't conditional on whether somebody appears suspicious to you. Damn. You could see Denise realizing in real time that the crowd was drifting away from her. Then Ethan delivered the kill shot. He pulled out copies of signed homeowner statements and placed them on the table. I also spoke with several residents who were told these inspections were required under HOA insurance policy. One board member frowned immediately. Wait, insurance policy? Ethan nodded. Can the board produce documentation from the HOA insurer requiring inspection of private homeowner equipment stored inside garages? Silence. Real silence this time. Denise looked toward the treasurer. Treasurer looked toward the secretary. Secretary suddenly became deeply interested in her water bottle. Because here's what was happening underneath the surface. The other board members were realizing Denise may have been freelancing authority under the HOA's name. And if that was true, their liability exposure just became everybody's problem. Ethan kept going, calm as ever. I also contacted my own homeowner's insurance carrier, he said. They informed me that unauthorized third-party inspection activity involving personal equipment storage could create claim disputes if property damage or injury occurred during these interactions. One older man in the audience muttered, Jesus Christ, yeah, exactly. Because once insurance enters the conversation, HOA board members suddenly remember they're volunteers, not kings. Denise tried recovering. Mr. Mercer appears determined to create unnecessary conflict. Ethan looked directly at her for the first time all night. No, Miss Hallbrook. I'm asking for documentation before surrendering property access rights. And honestly, that line landed like a hammer. You could practically watch half the neighborhood mentally replay every uncomfortable interaction they'd ever had with the HOA. Lorraine Bennett finally stood up from the back row, voice shaky but determined. She inspected my garage too. Then another resident raised his hand. Mine as well. Then another. And another. It snowballed so fast Denise couldn't stop it. Suddenly, the meeting wasn't about Ethan anymore. It became a public airing of years of quiet resentment people had swallowed because nobody wanted to be the difficult resident. One homeowner described being threatened with escalating fines over a generator inspection. Another said Denise photographed storage shelves without permission. A younger couple said they were told refusing inspection could affect community standing. That phrase alone nearly made the HOA attorney choke when he arrived halfway through the meeting. Oh yeah, they'd called the HOA attorney. And the second he heard the words unauthorized inspection practices, his entire posture changed. He started asking very careful questions. Were these inspections documented in official board motions? Silence. Was legal counsel consulted regarding interior property authority? More silence. Did the HOA insurer request these procedures in writing? Denise finally snapped. I was protecting the community. But by then it was over. Because intent stops mattering once procedure collapses. The attorney requested a private recess with the board. 20 uncomfortable minutes later, they returned looking like people exiting a funeral home. The attorney cleared his throat and announced that all pending inspection-related violations would be suspended pending legal review. Translation? Denise was cooked. But Ethan wasn't done. After the meeting ended, several homeowners approached him outside, near the parking lot under those ugly yellow clubhouse lights. Lorraine looked emotional. Nobody's ever stood up to her before. Ethan shrugged slightly. Most people don't realize they can. And honestly, that was the entire story right there. Not the garage, not the mower, not even the fine. It was about how easily ordinary people surrender boundaries when authority sounds confident enough. 3 weeks later, Denise Hallbrook resigned from the HOA board citing personal stress and community hostility, which is suburban code for the neighborhood finally stopped being scared of me. The board quietly issued formal notice that garage inspections had never been official HOA policy. Funny how fast standard procedure disappears once lawyers start asking for paperwork. And the wildest part? Ethan never sued anybody, never threatened legal action, never even raised his voice. He simply forced people to prove the authority they claimed to have, and the entire thing collapsed under its own weight. You know what's funny about stories like this? Most people hear them and immediately think, wow, that HOA president was crazy. But honestly, that's usually not the real problem. The real problem is how systems like this slowly train normal people to stop questioning authority altogether. Because once enough residents comply out of fear, exhaustion, or social pressure, the line between actual rules and made-up rules starts getting blurry real fast. And that's dangerous, not just in HOAs, but anywhere power exists without accountability. The lesson here is, confidence is not the same thing as authority. Somebody speaking firmly while holding a clipboard does not automatically mean they're legally correct. And people like Denise understand something deeply psychological. Most homeowners would rather surrender small rights than risk becoming the difficult neighbor. That fear keeps entire communities quiet. This is a psychological trap, one built around social discomfort more than actual law. Nobody wants tension with neighbors. Nobody wants nasty looks at the mailbox or awkward silence during neighborhood barbecues. So instead of asking questions, people comply first and rationalize it later. And honestly, that's why Ethan mattered so much in this story. Not because he was aggressive. Not because he was some action movie hero. Quite the opposite. He stayed calm. He documented everything. He asked for proof instead of arguing emotionally. From a legal perspective, that's usually how real power works. Quiet, patient, precise. According to standard procedure, legitimate authority should always survive transparency. If somebody truly has the right to inspect, enforce, fine, or enter your property, the documentation should exist immediately and clearly. If they start dodging questions, leaning on intimidation, or repeating vague phrases like community safety without specifics, that's your signal to slow the conversation down and start reading carefully. Because once you surrender boundaries out of fear, it becomes easier and easier for those boundaries to disappear permanently. And look, this story isn't really about garages or lawn equipment. It's about what happens when one person finally interrupts a culture of automatic compliance. The second Ethan asked, "Show me the rule," the illusion started cracking. Then everybody else realized they should have been asking the same question years ago. So now I want to ask you, If your HOA knocked on your door tomorrow demanding access to part of your property, would you know your actual rights? Or would you comply just because they sounded official? Let me know in the comments. And trust me, some of the stories people have about HOAs are even crazier than this one.